So we want to continue our discussion on the specific factors model today. You may recall that on Tuesday, when I introduced the specific factors model, I was talking about the DeSoto Auto Facility on the east side of Detroit, which has stood empty for the last 52 years. Well, in today's New York, actually this is yesterday's New York Times, there's an article about old GM plants linger on amid blight and scavenging. This is a long article talking about several of the GM facilities, particularly those in Michigan, that have been closed down over the last 5 to 10 years, that are sitting there essentially abandoned. Specific factors, they've got all that land, all those facilities, most of the machinery's been taken out, but all that money that's associated with owning that land and those factories still being captured in that industry, in some cases here more recently than the DeSoto plant, but still being captured there for some period of time. So if you're a Vulture speculator, you can probably swoop into the North Flint GM facility and probably buy up that land at something less than 10 cents on the dollar. That's what they're offering it for. There are no takers. So that tells you just how specific those resources are. Okay, so today we want to continue with our discussion. So just a really quick review on our specific factors model. Remember, with the specific factors model, we're talking about a model where we actually have 3 factors of production. We're also producing 2 different goods. One of the factors of production can be used in the production of either good. And typically the mobile factor is labor, right? I mean, one of the things that we need for the production of any good or service is a worker, at least one. Got to come in and turn on the machine in the morning, I guess, but you need at least workers. So workers are going to be in both industries, and most of the time we think of labor as being the mobile factor. So this particular diagram shows us the first part of our specific factors model, but it's looking at the mobile factor rather than either one of the specific factors. Once again, the horizontal axis represents the supply of labor in the economy. So that's basically the length of the horizontal axis tells us what our supply curve is, or our fixed supply of labor is. We know in order to find equilibrium, both the allocation of labor between the 2 industries as well as the equilibrium wage, we need to look at not only supply but also the demand side. The value of the marginal product of labor in automobiles was the demand curve for labor for that industry, and the value of the marginal product curve for food was the demand curve for labor in the food industry. So because we've got the food industry on the right-hand axis and the autos on the left hand, we get these crossing demand curves, and their intersection point tells us the equilibrium level allocation of labor between the 2 industries and also the equilibrium wage rate in the 2 industries. Notice once again, because we're assuming that the factor can move between either of the 2 industries freely and costlessly, that the wages in the 2 industries must equalize. Otherwise, the workers will move to the other industry. So as long as we've got that assumption, we're going to have the same wage rate in both industries. Now, notice also that the demand for labor curves can shift for either of 2 reasons. Right? We can have a shift either because the price of the product has changed, the price of autos or the price of food, or because the marginal product of labor in the industry has changed. So either one of those will cause a shift in the demand for labor curve in one of the 2 industries. So that's our mobile factor. The other 2 resources that we had, we assumed were specific to the industries, the other 2 resources we assumed were specific to individual industries. In our particular example that we're using here, we're assuming that capital is specific to the auto industry and that land is specific to the food industry. Yeah, seems pretty obvious. We're also assuming that there's a fixed supply of each of these resources. So our supply curves are vertical lines at whatever the level of that resource actually is. In this case, K bar. In this case, T bar. So that gives us our supply curve. Now again, in order to figure out what the equilibrium wage or return to these factors of production are, we also need the demand for the factor of production. But the demand for the factor of production, again, is no more than the value of the marginal product of capital in the case of the auto industry and the value of the marginal product of land in the case of the food industry. So we have the demand for land, we have the demand for capital, put up against its supply. We also can see what happens when, or what the equilibrium rates of return are. So the equilibrium return to capital, the owners of capital, is R sub K, and the equilibrium return to the owners of land is R sub T. So we generally call those rental rates, the rental rate for capital or the rental rate for land. So that gives us parts 2 and 3 of our specific factors model. Now, we also use the specific factors models, or can, with production possibilities frontiers and relative supply and relative demand curves. So what we can see, not so much from what we've done so far, but from what we've done before, and what we assumed is that if we look at the relative price of autos, we've assumed essentially that Japan has a comparative advantage in auto industry. The U.S. having a comparative advantage in the food industry. So if we're looking at the relative price of automobiles, which is what we have on our vertical axis, then that suggests the relative supply for automobiles will be further to the right for Japan, the country that has a comparative advantage, than for the United States, the country with a comparative disadvantage. Again, under our assumption that we have homothetic demand, that is, the demand curves, tastes, and preferences are the same between the 2 countries, and therefore the demand curves are the same, we would end up with a lower autarky relative price for autos in Japan than we would in the United States. Remember, it's those price differentials here that give us the opportunity for gains from international trade. So these price differentials are what's going to be important in terms of exploiting the gains from trade that we might have. Now, in this particular model, we didn't say anything about the production possibilities frontier or why Japan had a comparative advantage in automobiles in the U.S. in food. But from what we've done earlier, we know that if we were thinking in terms of the Ricardian model, that it must be that Japanese auto workers are relatively more productive than American auto workers compared to Japanese workers relative to American workers in the food industry. Or it might be that autos are capital intensive and Japan is capital abundant, where food is land intensive and the U.S. is land abundant. So whether we were thinking in terms of the comparative advantage with the Ricardian model or comparative advantage with respect to the way we set up the Heckscher-Rollin model doesn't really matter. Either of those or both could be our explanation for the pattern of comparative advantage that we're actually looking at in this particular case. So after we have set this up, of course, what we want to do is allow the 2 countries to engage in free trade. We'll see once again that the relative prices will converge. In this case, the relative price of autos in the U.S. falls, and the relative price of automobiles in Japan rises. So back to our relative supply and demand curves, we're going to see some price convergence and we end up somewhere in the middle. Now, I want to introduce one more assumption. Again, it's an assumption for simplicity purposes. It's not required to get the results that we're about to get, but it will be helpful in terms of simplicity to point out specific features in terms of our conclusions. And so we're also going to suppose that the price of food is fixed. So notice that the implication of that assumption is that any changes in the relative price of automobiles is because of a change in the price of automobiles only. Again, it's just a simplicity factor. It's not necessarily required, but it'll make it much easier to show the results that we want to show. So, of course, what this means is that the price of autos in the U.S. falls, and the price of autos in Japan increases. So not just relative prices, but also absolute prices. So let's see if we can demonstrate the gains from trade. So this is the U.S. And in autarky, we will be producing and consuming at point A, where the country indifference curve is just tangent to the production possibilities curve, generating relative prices that are our autarky prices from before. But now the relative price of autos is going to fall, which implies that the slope of the ISO value budget line will become steeper. So now we have a slope that's equal to the negative of the world relative price for autos. Sure, why not? Okay, this is Japan. No, yes, it is flatter. Thank you. Okay. That's why I do it electronically. It's easier to erase. Okay, so yes, let's get this correct. The slope becomes flatter and is equal to the negative of the world relative price. Notice what happens is production now moves to point B. The U.S. will reduce its production of autos, and it will increase its production of food. So notice that the U.S. then has become more specialized in food production, the product in which it has a comparative advantage. It is also not completely specialized. So the U.S. now also is, well, let's do the consumption part first, I'll come back to that. Okay, so now we're going to also change our consumption pattern. So we're producing at B, which tells us how much income we've earned, but now we get to decide how to trade off one good for the other along this new budget line. And so we're going to end up then on a higher country indifference curve, in which the demand for autos has gone way up, and the demand for food has gone down. So now we're producing more food than we're consuming domestically, so we've created an export sector for the economy in the good in which we have a comparative advantage. The U.S. has a comparative advantage, in this case food. And we also we're consuming more autos than we're producing, so we also have created an import industry in the good in which we have a comparative disadvantage, in this case autos for the U.S. Notice, however, we are producing some automobiles domestically. Right? We're still producing right here. It's a smaller industry than it was, but we are producing automobiles domestically. So we also have, once we open it up to international trade, not only do we create an export sector for the economy in the goods in which we have a comparative advantage, we also create an import competing industry in the goods in which we have a comparative disadvantage. Okay? So here we've got an export industry that we didn't have before. And over here we've created an import competing industry. But again, notice by specializing along the lines of comparative advantage, being able to buy things at the world relative price, puts the economy on a higher country indifference curve. So at least the level of aggregate economic welfare has been improved. We'll talk about the distribution of income in just a few minutes. Okay, so now let's think about Japan. So in Japan, the relative price of automobiles rose, which means that the slope of the ISO value budget line is now steeper. At the whatever the new world relative price is. Because the price of automobiles, relative price of automobiles has gone up, Japan will want to produce more autos. In order to produce more autos, they have to take some resources away from food production, so food production goes down. And the economy is now producing at point B. So point B then tells us what we're producing, the combinations of autos and food that we're actually producing. What we produce also tells us what our income is. But now, when we decide to spend our income, we get to spend it along this new, steeper budget line, which says that we can increase our consumption possibilities, and we will move to a new, higher country indifference curve, which shows that the level of aggregate economic welfare has been improved. So we're now consuming at point C. So the domestic demand for autos in Japan has gone down. Autos are more expensive. And the Japanese domestic demand for food has gone up because the relative price of food in Japan is now less expensive. As we've already seen, with the U.S., we end up with just the opposite situation in Japan. We now are consuming more food than we are producing in Japan, so Japan now has to be importing food. But once again, notice Japan is still producing food domestically. So we don't have complete specialization. And this means, of course, that we now have created an import competing industry. At the same time, Japan's now producing more automobiles than they're consuming domestically, with the excess going to exports, in our example, to the U.S. So we now also have an export industry that didn't previously exist. Again, notice that by specializing along the lines of comparative advantage, in Japan's case towards more automobiles and away from food, they are able to not change their income, but they're also able, through international trade, to consume along a very different budget line than they had available to them in our Turkey. And that, by producing more of a good that's rising in prices, gives them greater consumption possibilities. Notice we're now consuming outside the production possibilities frontier. In fact, if you think about it, the U.S. is consuming outside its production possibilities frontier. So remember, in our Turkey, both countries have to consume on their production possibilities frontier. But with international trade, we can actually see both countries consuming beyond their production possibilities frontier. So what does that say about the level of world output? Gone up, stay the same, gone down? Has to go up. If we're consuming more, we have to be producing more. So with the same amount of economic resources, we're now able to increase production, world production, and therefore world consumption, by specializing in a more efficient way, specializing production in a more efficient way, along the lines of comparative advantage. And that's what we've end up with here. Okay, so everybody's happy. We have these gains from international trade. Well, maybe everybody's happy. Let's find out. So one of the things that we saw with the Hechter-Ohlin model is that even though we had this assumption that factors of production could move between both industries, there were still people who gained from international trade, the owners of the abundant factors of production, but there were also people who lost from international trade, the owners of the scarce factors of production. So we know that international trade can cause differences in the distribution of income. Well, now we've got three factors of production, both a mobile factor and two specific factors. So we also need to think about, for both the U.S. and Japan, who's better off, who's worse off? Is anybody worse off? But we need to think about workers, we need to think about capital owners, and we need to think about the landowners. So in order to think about the mobile factor, the workers, this, by the way, will be, let's make this the U.S. And so let's also remember what we've seen here. We've assumed that the price of food is fixed. And we also have the price of automobiles in the U.S. falling. Of course, the price of automobiles shows up in the demand for labor in the auto industry. If the price of automobiles falls, then the value of the marginal product of workers in the automobile industry has also declined. So now this demand for labor curve is going to shift down. So this is our new world. Let me put a superscript W for world just to highlight that. No, it's not parallel. Yeah, I mean, it almost looks parallel, doesn't it? But it's not. It's not supposed to be parallel. Yes, it makes a difference. So if the price falls 10%, it's going to fall a bigger number on this side, which started at a very high number, then it will fall on this side. Right? So that's why it's not parallel. Okay, so we've got a lower demand for labor taking place in the auto industry because of the lower world price for automobiles. So notice that we can already see two other things that are going to happen. And they're very easy to see here. We're going to end up with fewer workers in the auto industry and more workers in the food industry. We also